Welcome to the Happy Mama Movement podcast. I'm Amy Taylor-Kabbaz, mama, journalist, coach, and founder of Mama Rising. This podcast is a space of community and collaboration. We gather stories of matrescence, motherhood, womanhood, and change told by our Mama Rising coaches and mothers around the globe, in the knowing that through our stories, we can begin to heal and change the way the world sees, values, and supports mothers everywhere. So, welcome to the Happy Mama Movement. Welcome back, everybody. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of the term the mental load. This refers to all of the things that we hold in our head that we are thinking about and trying to manage and juggle that goes alongside raising children. These are the things like RSVPing for birthday parties, organising the birthday present, making sure that they get to the dentist, remembering the mother-in-law's Christmas present, all of the tiny and often sometimes not so tiny tasks that culturally and historically has fallen on the mother's shoulders. Over the last decade or so, I have seen such huge changes in the language and awareness around what it means to be a mother these days. And this concept of the mental load is one of the big breakthroughs, I think. Because when I think back to the early days of my motherhood experience, this heavy load that I felt fell on my shoulders was enormous. It added to my burnout and resentment and anger and made such a huge difference to the way I felt about myself, my marriage, my relationship, and the world really. Which is why I really wanted to speak with Dr. Robyn Miller. Robyn is a paediatrician, a mother, a wife, and founder of the Mental Load Project, an organisation which aims to help women and men recognise and rebalance all of those invisible labour tasks in their lives. She has online programs and has helped dozens of couples in over 10 countries figure out how to do this differently. She's also just had her third baby, so she is living and breathing this. And in this interview, we really explain what the mental load is, but also how can we finally make this more fair and equitable at home and hopefully even at the workplace. Enjoy. Robyn, welcome to the Happy Mama Movement podcast. I know you have just a baby of a couple of months old, so squeezing this in is quite impressive. So thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
So we want to talk today about the mental load. Just a few years ago, I don't think that this was a very common term. It does seem to be growing in awareness, thank goodness. But for those of us who aren't fully aware of what we mean by the mental load, could you explain that to us?
Of course, and I agree. I think when I first started doing this work 5 years ago, it was not as commonly used as a term and not as well known, but it has gained more traction. And I think that's really important because what it describes is all the invisible load and invisible labor that goes into managing anything. And when we're talking about that in a household and family sense, then we're thinking about what it takes to notice what needs to be done, remember what needs to be done, plan for those things, check that they went okay, remember to buy the toothpaste, know when the next birthday party is and get a present for that, plan how you're going to organize school holiday care for your children, remember when the sheets were last washed, all of these things that go beyond just actually physically, reserving the place in the after school hours care for your child or actually putting the load of washing in the washing machine. There's so much that has to happen that's sort of invisible and that has generally fallen to women because of sort of ways that we've grown up and what we see in society. And so whilst there's been more of a balance potentially in the physical tasks in a household, that remembering and reminding and who's sort of ultimately responsible to make sure something gets done and gets done well enough has tended to still fall to women and to mothers. And so that burden is not really often seen and therefore not really often appreciated either, and then can just lead to this sort of growing burden of things that we have to think and do and remember. It takes up brain space and takes time. Just because it's invisible doesn't mean that it just gets done automatically. It takes time and it takes, thinking power. But when it's not equitably shared, then it can really lead to like a lot of resentment within a relationship, and then also like is not fair in terms of who gets to have a bit of extra time to do their hobby or some more brain power to think of creative solutions for work or whatever it might be. So although we think about the mental load in a household sense, it goes much beyond that, and it really affects, I guess, gender equality in all spheres.
I love that, because I think so often it's so invisible. The mother or the woman who is carrying most of this load is not even aware of the impact it's having on her.
Mm,
When I coached women, especially back when before I understood all of this, it was part of it was actually allowing them to see how much they're doing and not being seen or acknowledged for it or appreciated for it, and recognizing how huge that is. Sometimes I think if we were to write down all the things that we're carrying in our minds at the moment and all the things that we're half organizing and thinking about what we need to do, it would blow our minds, because we're not even aware of how much this load is.
mm. And when I say it's not appreciated, it's often not appreciated by ourselves even, because
Exactly.
it's just like automatically taken upon and you don't really even realize that. And you don't necessarily then appreciate or realize the impact it's having even on you personally. And so I
Mm.
think that it's really important when we think of matrescence and we think of that journey that you go through, that even to have the space and to allow yourself sort of the thinking power to be able to undergo those developments. Like if you're entirely burdened with all of these 100 things, 1,000 things you're trying to remember and do, then you don't even allow yourself even the space and the time to go through those developments and have that time for yourself.
So, in your work, what do you see as the impact of the invisible mental load on women?
So like I said, I think it sort of diffuses through all spheres of society. Like the impact is at home, but then it's in the workplace. It's the impact of what our children see and therefore what kind of subconscious messages they're getting. I think often if I'm thinking about women I work with, like they're women who are really highly achieving. So they're still doing a fantastic job in all aspects, home, work, everything. They're still managing it all. But it's usually the first thing that goes is that it's at the cost to themselves, and especially at the cost to their relationship,
Mhm.
because they went into a partnership thinking it was equal. And the research about the mental load says that, look, even before children, it's probably not equal. Like if you think about a heterosexual relationship and who remembers or looks, to RSVP to a mutual wedding that you're invited to, and who checks the dress code for that and organizes a present, or who organizes, Christmas presents for parents and parents-in-law. Like there's differences even before children are involved. But it's
Mm.
just once there are dependents, pets, children, that the amount of mental load that you have within your couple and your household increases so astronomically that then it's really when that burden is felt. And so I think usually like women are keeping up with all of this, but it's at a huge cost to themselves, and then this sort of resentment that builds in, because they're like, well, why am I doing all of this? And if you don't have enough understanding and enough sort of learning and language around the mental load, then you can end up in these sort of discussions with your partner that are going nowhere, because he's saying, well, just ask me, like I want to help, just tell me what to do. And you're saying, well, that's the whole problem. Why do I have to tell you what to do? Like, why can't you see what needs to be done? And I always say it's not either person's fault. It's not, the man's fault. It's not the woman's fault. It's just that we, as we've grown up, have found ourselves sort of attaching to these learned behaviors because that's all we've witnessed. And so we need to really make a deliberate change on both parts to move that forward.
I'd love to come back to that conversation that so many of us have with our partners, which, refers to I need more help doing this, well, just tell me what to do, which is unto itself a huge mental load of trying to manage the list of what to put out and what to delegate. But before we get there, I'd love to come back to that point of, it's almost ingrained in us that women are the ones who remember the things like the mother-in-law's birthday or RSVPing. But there is no biological reason why we are better at that. Can we talk about that for a moment? Because in my own personal journey through this work, my baby is now 16. So I often find myself in these podcasts, Robyn, reflecting on, I wonder what would have been different, especially in my marriage, if I had understood these concepts 16 years ago. Because I will be very honest, resentment was a big problem in my marriage. I found it really hard that so much of that fell on me and couldn't understand why that was automatic. And that was a source of such great stress and anger and resentment, mostly within myself. So when we are trying to approach this in a healthy, aware way, can we talk about, first of all, why is it assumed that we are better at this, and debunk that myth that, just because we're a woman, it means we know how to do this. And then let's talk about how do we talk about that with our partner.
So that first part, I just think that it's really comes down to social conditioning and what we have witnessed and therefore adopted as we've grown up. And a lot of that is subconsciously, and some of it is even almost instructed, like the way that and what's expected of daughters versus sons and sisters versus brothers, is different. And I didn't really get exposed to that and notice that as a child. Like, I've only got 2 sisters and I have no brothers, but there is research to show that the amount of housework that girls and sort of chores that girls do versus boys is different at home, but also the types of activities that girls might be asked to do, like, oh, do you want to go and write a card for grandma? It's that type of thing that boys are just asked to do less. And so, and then girls and boys see their mothers and fathers doing it differently, and see that it's, their mum who makes sure that she knows what's for dinner. And even if dad's cooked, then, mum knows where things are around the house and mum notices this. And if I ask a question, then it's mum who's going to know how I find it, what I do, where it is, that kind of thing. And so you just adopt these behaviors. And as girls, you then think, oh, well, that's what I'm responsible for. Even if we don't even really think it, it's just a subconscious acquisition of, okay, well, this is what's involved, that boys don't necessarily get exposed to. And absorb. And so then when you enter that relationship, you sort of just start doing it automatically. And the more you do it, this is what I always say, the more organized you get, the better you get at the mental load, the more you take on, and the less your partner can even see that you're doing it.
Yes.
Because if you know exactly where things are, or if you always replenish the toilet paper before it's even out, then it's never even thought that, well, someone's doing that, someone's noticing that, someone's remembering that. And so the more organized you get, the better you get at it, just from practice, not from any biological reason. And then you just take on more and more of it, and that imbalance becomes even greater.
That's so true. I think all of us who have sons at home, and especially if you have both genders of children, sons and daughters, to have that awareness of the jobs that you're giving them around the house. That's such a great little reminder. I also think, I think sometimes we also opt into this ourselves. You know, this idea of being a good mother is the one who's on top of all of the tasks. She's the one who knows when it's book week and RSVPs to that. She's often the one in the WhatsApp group chat for the class parents. I mean, we're dads in those WhatsApp groups. It drives me crazy. You know, I think we also, there's so many layers to this. Society does this to us. There's an automatic assumption in relationships, but also internally we hold ourselves to that standard sometimes. And that makes it hard to change. It makes us feel like, if I don't do all of this, am I a good mum?
And am I letting my children down? Like,
Mm.
if they don't have their taxa ordered today, then is that, then it's, they're go, you know, the child's going to be upset, and then you're probably the one doing the emotional labor of, you know, trying to console the child at the end of the day too. And so it's just that thing of, oh, it's easier if I just do it myself, and we get in that habits of, well, it is easier. And the conversations that we're having with other women are about, oh, well, have you got the book week costume organized, or did you know that you know, the school camp's coming up? Whereas if men aren't having those conversations, then it's not in their mind. And similarly, it's all of the messages we're getting from our social media feeds. Like, if you think about what comes up on your social media feed versus what might come up on your partner's social media feed, you know, they're getting the US election, they're getting sport, they're getting whatever they're interested in, and you're getting ideas for like lunch boxes, or, you know, what Johnny ate and how you design a toddler meal that looks perfect on a plate. Like, that's just what is fed to us. So it's in our mental load. So unless we make a deliberate decision within ourselves and within our relationship to change, then you just end up with this even greater split, and it becomes even harder to work out any sort of equality and equal share of the mental load.
So, how do we approach a conversation around this with our partner?
So how is the best way versus how we do? How we do is usually, you know, you get to that breaking point and you're
Yeah.
like, what? Why is this happening? And, you know, and then it's not constructive at all, because, you know, you're both in your defenses. Like, why is this like that? The more constructive way is actually to be quite deliberate about it and set down a time and a place when you can constructively talk about it, and even discuss the mental load. And whilst it might be more in our vernacular and our language now, it's probably not in your partner's as much. And
Mm.
so having a way to explain it to them can be helpful. And even if you come down to things about, well, think about what the invisible labor is of anything at work. There's, you know, in a workplace, there is someone who is responsible for organising whatever event that's happening, making sure the catering's done, making sure the venue's booked, checking on the RSVPs, emailing everyone the reminders. All of that happens. And that in some ways is all that invisible load that just happens for any event daily, or, you know, bigger event at home. So if you think about it in a workplace sense, that is someone's role. There is someone who is the project manager. There is someone who is working in the administrative task. There is all of those people. And in a workplace sense, apart from social workplace events, I'd have to say, still tend to fall to women to organise a Christmas party or the baby shower or whatever. But within an actual workplace event that's an organised event, all of those things are happening and being paid. So depending on what your partner's work life is like, they might have more of an appreciation if you do an analogy with the workplace, or just if you even just say, look, you know, over the last 3 days, like, this is all the things I've thought about, these are all the conversations I've had to plan this or that. And so really what I'd like is that we can really get down to dividing this at the outset better, so that I'm not just delegating things, and I'm not just asking you to pick up that, or I'm not just asking you to cook dinner on Friday night. I'm actually saying, okay, I will be responsible for all of these tasks, and you'll be responsible for all of these. And then having some grace and patience for both of you as you're learning those new tasks. So our role, if we have been the mental load bearer, is just to take a step back and give our partners grace and appreciate that, we got so good at it by doing it for decades. And so we can't expect them to do it to our standard, next week. But in the same way, the more times we remind or, gently nag, then we're not allowing them to even take that on as their mental load. We're still ultimately holding it ourselves. And then similarly on their side, give us the grace and patience when we do accidentally say, oh, have you remembered? Or I'm really worried about the fact that you might forget the next, that swimming happens on a Friday for, our daughter and on a Thursday for our son. And I'm worried that they're going to forget their togs. And then, that type of thing, just having the conversation and really trying to, I always say, divide, not delegate. So divide whole tasks and whole responsibilities. And then if that thing is forgotten or not done well enough, then that person is then responsible for picking up the pieces. And then if you sort of allow yourselves both to work in that way, it will only take a couple of times of your partner, realizing that it's not particularly efficient to have to run back to school at 3 o'clock to drop the togs off or drop the instrument off for music practice or whatever it might be, for them to realize, okay, I need to remember this. Whereas if you've said on Thursday morning, make sure, David has his violin today, then you haven't passed on that mental load at all. You've still kept it. And all we're doing is allowing the same processing and same conditioning to keep happening.
Such a wonderful point that you mentioned, grace on both sides, because it is such a learnt skill for us to be able to manage and hold all of this. I'm sure in your work and in your research, you've come across maternal gatekeeping, this another term that's used a lot around how we almost struggle, we overmanage it and over control it and struggle to let it go. To our partner, to our mother-in-law, to the help that is on offer. And that we have to, in the releasing of those tasks or that load, we have to allow this space for them to fail at it too. Because so often when, especially you've been an anxious new mum and you are the only one who's been able to settle your baby for the first 6 months or something like that, we need to acknowledge what it feels like to allow somebody else to step into that space and the feelings that come up inside us when we see that the partner or the mother-in-law is not able to settle the baby like we can. And we have to get to that point where we are okay with that. They're going to do it their way. It may take a bit longer. They may do it differently. And that is such a beautiful but confronting process of letting go in motherhood, especially around those early months and years, don't you think?
Definitely. And I think it's great when there is an opportunity for fathers to, like, one of the easiest ways to sort of balance the mental load is to have a period of time when fathers are the primary carers, and there is a, more, it's still slow, but that is happening more frequently, I think, now than even 10 years ago. But in doing so, I've watched as women then set up their, all the activities that the father needs to do and make sure that the bag's already prepped in the morning, and, be like, okay, well, on Wednesday you can go to rhyme time and on Thursday you can go to this music group because you've done it for 6 months and you know how it works. And so you want your partner to have a good experience because you don't want them to hate it. And so instead of allowing, as you say, allowing our partners to learn and maybe fail, but then learn through that whole process like you did, we often still gatekeep and keep that mental load with us when, the baby is going to be okay and your partner is going to be okay. And if they're not, they can ask, or they can Google, or they can find out these things. And that is one of the great signs you can see, I think, when the mental load is fairly shared, is that your partner might come home and say, and this is my example, when after we'd split up the things better with after our firstborn was born, then my partner came home and started talking about that he had a chat to some of the people at work about what they fed their toddlers. It's like, oh, there you go. Like, this is now part of your mental load. You're thinking about it. So you're having those conversations at work. And so if we can normalize it, that, all people talk about this, and that it's in your mental load enough that it is just coming up spontaneously in different conversations, then that is a sign that, you have actually released some of that mental load and that your partner has taken on some of that mental load.
Yeah, I love that. I love dad standing around at the office talking about toddler food. Yes, please. So you have three children, 6, 2, and just a newborn, a couple of months old. As you went into third time matrescence, how have you and your
Mm.
partner this differently now with your work and your understanding of this?
Yeah, so that is interesting. So after our first, then I took the maternity leave, and I took 6 months off, and then I worked part-time for the next year or so. And then after our second, I actually only took 6 weeks off, and my partner stayed home for 9 months. And so that was a real split of sort of reversing things. And what I'd say with that is that we probably both it was a really interesting experience for each of us. He didn't love it. He really, but I really loved having a stay-at-home partner. Like, it was very handy.
Oh, yeah.
But also in the workplace, the way we were each treated, I think it I got a lot more leniency and sort of kindness and compassion shown to me, because everyone's like, "Oh, you've just come back, you just had a baby, like, what can we do?" Like, if I arrived late, it wasn't a problem. There was just that leniency given to me, that if whereas I had 6 weeks off, whereas if a father came back at 6 weeks, then it would be like, "Oh, wow, like, you took a long time off." And then lo and behold, like, you're arriving late, or you're needing to pop out for half an hour to, like, organize some milk or whatever, like, that wouldn't be the same leniency.
Yeah.
And so I think that taught me a lot about how we could treat new fathers differently in the workplace too. And then this time around, it's been me who's been on maternity leave again. And I mean, I think by the time you have a third child, then so much of your life is dominated by the other two, that they just have to fit
Mhm.
in. And that's definitely been my experience. But I think what I have noticed, just in terms of the mental load and going through this journey of matrescence a third time round, is that we now have the language and the ability to just have really frank, open discussions about the mental load without any of that heat and tension that we would have had 6 years ago. And so
Mm.
it was only a couple of days ago, my husband's like, "Oh, you've actually taken on more of the food prep now because you're at home, and, like, are you okay with that?" Or, like that we had this a real split between, I was responsible for laundry and he was responsible for food. And I think they're the two huge everyday tasks that every family with kids have. And so
Yes.
if you have any split, then, that's just a nice, easy split you can have. But because I am now home during the day, and it's easier for me just to chop some veggies and get something ready to put in the oven, while the two older ones are at kindy and school, and the baby's sleeping. So I might just do that. And so I have kind of taken more of that on. And so it was interesting when my husband said, "Is that okay? Are you happy with that?" And I said, "Look, I'm happy with it now. And I'm just also happy that that you appreciate that and realize that that's happened. And B, that we've got this communication and openness now, that we can have that chat, and I can say, yeah, it's fine now, because, actually the third baby is a dream and is sleeping better than any of my other children have ever slept, and even sleep now probably. So I can do that. But when that, if we get to that 4 months and everything changes, then we have the openness, the communication, and the flexibility and the language around the mental load to be able to address it early, before that resentment and frustration builds up."
Yes, sometimes we just need it to be seen, don't we? We just need it to be
Mm.
acknowledged. I can see that you're doing all of this, or I can see there's a lot of extra things on your plate at the moment. Gosh, that is just sometimes, more often than not, the biggest part that mothers most need in this process, especially in those early months when it may just have to fall on her shoulders more. to be seen and heard and have the language around that makes a huge difference.
Exactly.
Robyn, it's been so good to speak with you. I love that these conversations are now being spoken about, both between mothers and in places like this, but also in workplaces. I think this is a big turning point where we can start to acknowledge that when a woman returns from a maternity leave, or a father returns from paternity leave, that when they walk in through that front door, it's not like they just leave that part of themselves behind, that this is so often this pull between home and work. And if we really want to get the best out of our working parents, we have to acknowledge what they're holding and all the things they're doing, usually invisibly. So yeah, it's a great time. I think we're starting to make some headways.
And if we can have that equal share, it doesn't have to be 50-50 equal share, but some fair share in the mental load at home, then more men in the workplace will also appreciate what's going on, because they're carrying that mental load too. And so that fairness in the workplace just continues as well, and it becomes the new norm.
Yeah, let's hope. Thank you so much for finding time to speak with me with your beautiful little baby in the background. But yeah, thank you so much. We'll pop all the details of your work around the Mental Load Project and what you're able to do to support couples and women in the show notes. Thank you again.
My pleasure, Amy. Thank you very much.
Thanks, as always, for being a part of our global matrescence community. Please take a moment and make sure you're subscribed to this podcast in your podcast player so you can always be notified of our next episode. And if you would like to work with a coach on your own experience of matrescence, please go to mamarising.net and explore our directory of phenomenal coaches, workshop leaders, space holders and facilitators around the globe. You can also explore our Global Matrescence Foundation and consider donating so a mama in need can access the support of one of our coaches and still ensure that our coaches receive the income and support they need so they can continue to work in this way. And finally, if you would like to be a coach, a facilitator and a matrescence activist in your own community, jump on our waitlist for our next intake of the Mama Rising Facilitator Training at mamarising.net. Thank you for being here and being part of this movement. Until next week, bye.